Be'ezrat Hashem, with Hashem's help, we begin today Hilchos, Tefillah, Ubirkas Kohanim, the second set of laws in the second book of the Rambam, the laws of davening and the priestly blessing. The Rambam tells us, as he does before every set of laws, which mitzvahs these chapters will be discussing. Yesh bichlalan shtei mitzvot aseh. Included in the 15 chapters of this set of laws, we will discuss two mitzvahs, two positive mitzvahs. Aleph, la'avodet Hashem b'chol yom batfilah. Number one, to serve Hashem every day in davening. He doesn't just say to pray. He says to serve Hashem in prayer. Because unlike almost every other mitzvah, tefillah, prayer, and the service of prayer go directly hand in hand. Other mitzvahs, it's mainly the deed which counts. There are even certain mitzvahs where the intent that you have while you do the deed is inherent to the mitzvah. For example, sukkah. When we sit in a sukkah, we also must have in mind that Hashem put us in clouds of glory when we were in the desert. But in the end of the day, the intent and the action remain two distinct entities. When it comes to davening, which is the idea of the verbal expressions of one's needs, asking Hashem to fill our needs, the service, the intent that we have, the feeling that we're standing before a king and that we're pleading for our needs, is part and parcel of the deed. The words of davening have no meaning if they aren't filled with the feeling of what the Rambam will call later techina, literally a sense of pleading before a master who is all-powerful. That's why the Rambam says la'avod, because the mitzvah is that part of the, not just uttering words, not just saying, reading a prayer book. It's feeling it too. And bet, number two, is levarech kohanim et Yisrael b'chol yom. There's a special mitzvah for the priests to bless the Jews every single day. In its original form, the kohanim would bless the Jews every day. Today in Israel, there are many communities where that still takes place. Kohanim bless the Jews every day. Here outside of Israel, the prevalent minhag among Ashkenazim is to do it just on the holidays, and among Sephardim, some Sephardic communities, also every Shabbat. The Rebbe notes that b'chol yom, every day, is not just the time frame of the mitzvah, when the kohanim should bless, but it's also the result. The kohanim are supposed to bless the Jews in a way where they receive a continued goodness, b'chol yom, all day, every day. Ubiur shtei mitzvot elu b'prakim elu, the explanation of these two mitzvahs will be in the forthcoming 15 chapters. 13 chapters will be dedicated to davening, and the last two to the priestly blessing. It says the Rambam, Perek Rishon, chapter 1, halacha aleph, mitzvat aseh lehitpalel b'chol yom. It is a biblical commandment, a positive commandment, to daven every day. Shene'emar, as it says, va'avadetem et Hashem Elokechem. One verse says, you shall serve Hashem your God. Mipi hashmu'a lamdu. From oral tradition we learned, she'avodah zu hi tefillah. The service being referenced here is to prayer. How do we know that? Shene'emar, as it says in a different verse which we're more familiar with, from the daily Shema in the second chapter, the second paragraph, v'hayayim shamoa, it says, ule'ovdo b'chol levavechem. You should serve Hashem with all your heart. Amru chachamim, said our sages, ezo hi avodah shebalev zu tefillah. What is the service in the heart? It's davening. So the second verse says, you serve Hashem with all your heart. Heart service is davening. So in an earlier verse, where the Torah commands you expressly to serve Hashem, it means the same service of the heart, the service of davening. The first 5 words of this halacha are so crucial at every level. First, the Rambam calls it a biblical commandment. That's a huge revolution. Many commentaries were of the opinion that davening is a rabbinic ordination. It has no source in the Torah. It's not one of the 613. The Rambam famously argues and says that tefillah is not a biblical obligation. There's also a famous Hasidic discourse which says that tefillah is higher than mitzvahs. It can't be one of the 613 because it accomplishes something so much greater than the mitzvahs. The Rambam nevertheless believes that the mitzvah is biblically to daven. And he describes it as lehitpalel. Lehitpalel is a verb that implies speech. Even though I mentioned to you before that the most essential element is the heart feeling, the intent. Nevertheless, we've seen before already, when you have a mitzvah that has a thought element and a speech element, we count, in the 613 count, we count the idea of speech, like teshuvah. Teshuvah was a feeling in the heart, but also a verbal confession. The mitzvah that was counted was the verbal confession. So to over here, the mitzvah is lehitpalel, to daven, although in the earlier introduction, the Rambam did tell us a little more. It's la'avodet, to serve God. And the Rambam says b'chol yom. The Rambam is of the opinion that the biblical obligation is to daven once a day, every day. How do we know that? In the verse, it makes no mention of a time. Serve Hashem your God. Serve Hashem when? Maybe once a month, maybe once a year. So the Kesef Mishnah, the primary commentator here, says the Rambam understood that it has to mean every day. Because if not, then we would come to say, maybe it's once in a lifetime. V'zeh davar she'i efshar sheyisbeleu hadat. The mind can't handle that. If Torah says serve your God, it's got to be more than once in a lifetime. But the Rebbe says that's not a reason. Everybody understands. If you tell me, and the Rambam will tell us in a moment, that the mitzvah of davening is to pray for your needs, we all have needs. Maybe not every day we have needs, but certainly often enough to require davening often enough. So why can't the mitzvah just be daven to Hashem whenever you have needs? In fact, we do find mitzvahs that are only once a month or once or a couple of times a year. Kiddush Levana, we sanctify the new moon once a month. Korbanot, certain korbanot, only urban on Shabbat or holidays. What's the problem with having a mitzvah with regular intervals? Daven whenever you need. The Rebbe says that's the reason that other commentaries don't accept that interpretation. And what they say is that it's actually hinted in the verse. The verse we brought says, "Va'abadetem et Hashem Elokechem." The end of the verse says, "Ubeirach et lachmecha ve'et mimecha." When you serve Hashem, He will bless your bread and water. Which sounds like the service is directly linked to bread and water. We all need bread and water every day. Maybe not more than once a day. Maybe only once a day we need to have food, but we need to have food every day. That's why that's the prototype for the mitzvah in which we have to daven once a day. We're going to see rabbinically, we daven 3 times a day, sometimes even 4, and Yom Kippur 5. But biblically, the mitzvah is to express that Hashem should cover your basic needs every day. What about somebody who has no physical needs? The Rebbe says an example of in the olden days, for sure this was very common, where people used to get supported by their father-in-law. Take care of all the physical needs. What's he asking Hashem for? The Rebbe says, we all have other needs. Health. Your father-in-law can't take care of your health. You daven to Hashem to take care of your health. Children, other things. But be that as it may, the basic definition of the mitzvah here is to daven once a day to express your needs. The reason the Rambam brings 2 verses, the Rebbe also links to the earlier conversation I had with you before. Part of davening is asking for your needs, where you're at the center of it. Part of davening is feeling God, feeling how you're submitted to God, and you're asking it of Him with a pleading voice. So the Rambam brings the 2 verses to correspond to that. Va'abadetem et Hashem Elokechem is what you're doing. You're asking for your needs, as in the end of the verse, your bread and water. And le'avdo b'chol levavechem is the way you ask. You serve it with all your heart. You put your whole heart into it. You put your whole intent into it. Anyway, says the Rambam, you should know, ve'ein minyan hatfilot min haTorah. The number of davenings that we do every day is not biblical. Ve'ein mishneh hatfilah hazot min haTorah. Neither is the formula, the script, what we call today the nusach, the liturgy, is not biblically ordained. Ve'ein latfilah zman kavua min haTorah, and neither is there a set time during the day that prayer needs to take place. Biblically, we're going to see rabbinically, there is times for everything. Halacha bet, because there is no set time for davening, ulefichach, therefore, nashim va'avadim chayavin batfilah. Unlike the last set of laws, the laws of Kriyat Shema, where we learned clearly in the beginning of yesterday's chapter, that women are not obligated to do it because it's time-bound, and they're also not obligated from any time-bound mitzvahs. Since this one is not time-bound, women and slaves are obligated to daven. Lefi shehi mitzvata say, shalo hazman grama, because it is a positive commandment which is not bound by time. Ella rather chiyuv mitzvah zu kachu. The obligation of this mitzvah is the following. Sheyehi adam mitchanen umitpalel b'chol yom. A person should offer supplication, he should plead, and daven every day in the following way. Umagid shivcho shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You begin by declaring the praises of Hashem. V'achar kach shoel tzrachav shehu tzarich lahem. And then you request the needs that you need, bevakasha ubitchina, in a beseeching, pleading tone. And afterwards, noten shevach v'hodaya Hashem al hatovah she'ishpia lo. You express thanks and gratitude to God for the good that He has already given you. Kol echad lefi kocho, everyone according to his capacity. There was no siddur. There was no prayer book standard text. Everybody would daven as they wished. This was the basic way you did it, was you began with praise, requested your needs, and thanked Hashem, expressed gratitude. Which is, by the way, how our Shemona Esrei is set up today, as we'll see later in this chapter. So, that's the obligation. Whenever the need arises, and once a day according to the Rambam, you do this three-pronged process. Express praise, ask, and then thank. And notice that the Rambam only uses the word bakasha utchina, with pleading and with supplication, when it comes to asking for your needs. Because the beginning, the praise, is a prerequisite. The thanks is kind of an exit. But the main body of the davening is where you express what you need. And that has to be done with your emotions. Halakha Gimel says that Rambam, im haya ragil, if a person was fluent or eloquent in the way he would express himself, marbeh b'tchina bakasha, he would be able to increase in his pleading and requesting language. Ve'im hayad al sfatayim, but if he was stuffed of lips, which means he didn't have the linguistic knowledge to express what he wanted to say fluently, he would speak according to what he could speak, simpler language, more simplified terms. And he would do it whenever he wanted. And the same applied to the number of davenings. Everyone did this according to their capacity. There were those that would daven once a day. Those that would daven many times a day. Anybody, no matter how many times you daven and how you davened, everybody had one thing in common. They would daven opposite, facing the holy temple. Any place where he might be or where it might be. Either it's a reference to the person, wherever the person might be, he faces the temple, or wherever the temple might be, you face the temple. Because in earlier times, once the Jews came into Israel, the temple wasn't only in Jerusalem right away. It was first in Shiloh, then Nov, and Givon, Gilgal, different places. I may have said that backwards in the other order. First it was Gilgal, then Nov, Givon, then Shiloh. But be that as it may, wherever the temple currently was, you would face there. The Rambam says this was how the matter was constantly from Moshe Rabbeinu when the mitzvahs were originally given until Ezra the scribe, who lived in the time between the first and second temples and brought the Jews back to Israel to build the second temple. What happened then? A problem arose. Once the Jews were exiled in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who destroyed the first temple, the wicked one, the Jews became mixed in to Persia, to Greece, other nations. And children were born to them in these foreign lands. And because of that, those children, their language got mixed up. They weren't living in the biblical Israel speaking biblical Hebrew. Now they were speaking other languages. And the language of every single person was a mix of many different languages. And once he would begin to speak, he wasn't able to express all of his needs in one specific language, unless he would make mistakes. You tell a person who grew up in Persia to speak only in Persian or only in Lashon HaKodesh when he grew up in a Jewish home, he couldn't say everything in one language, Hebrew, or anything in the other language in Persian. He would have to mix. Shenemar, as it says in the verse in Nehemiah, U'bnehem, their children ended up speaking Chatzi Medaber Ashdodit. Half of them were speaking Ashdodit language, the Gomer, etc. As the verse continues, Ve'enam makirim Medaber Yehudit Mikilshon Am Va'am. They wouldn't be able to recognize the Jewish language to speak it. Instead, they were speaking like many other different nations. And because of this, people weren't fluent in either language. When one person would daven, Tiktsar Lishono, Lishol Chafatzav, his tongue became limited. He found himself at a loss for words to ask for all his needs or to express his full praise of Hashem in the holy tongue, in biblical Hebrew. Till he mixed in with it other languages. And that was improper, because if you're going to pray in biblical Hebrew, you pray only in biblical Hebrew. And if you're going to pray in another language, you pray fully in another language, as we'll see in later chapters. Therefore, once Ezra and his high court saw the situation, they stood up and enacted for the Jewish people 18 blessings in order. We call today the Amidah Shmona Esrei for this reason. Because Shmona Esrei means 18, and there's 18 blessings originally in the Shmona Esrei. And it was in the following order, also following the three-pronged process which we mentioned before. Shalosh Rishonot Shevach LaHashem. The first three blessings are an expression of praise for God. V'shalosh Achronot Hodaya. The last three blessings are thanks for Hashem. Ve'emtzayiyot, and the middle blessings, the 12 middle blessings, Yesh Bahen Sheilat Kol HaDvarim, express the requests for all things that we need. And when you read those paragraphs, they were written with wisdom and divine inspiration in a way, Shehin Kimo Avot, where they serve as parents or fathers, L'chol Cheftzei Ish Va'ish U'letzorchei HaTzibur Kulan, for all needs of the human being and for all communal needs. In other words, they cover everything. The sages were able to condense all of the human needs into these 12 blessings. And the sages made this Shmona Esrei, this 18 blessing prayer, so that it would be set up, it would be easily accessible in the mouths of everybody. And they'd be able to learn it. And now, these stunted people, people who couldn't express themselves fully, now when they daven, it will be a complete davening, because they'll be able to use the standardized siddur, which encapsulates everything. Ki tfilat ba'alei halashon hatzacha, they will be as complete as the davening of those who have a smooth tongue. And because of this reason, because of this topic, tiknu kol habrachot v'hatfilot mesudarot b'fi kol Yisrael, Ezra and his court went ahead and also established the formula for all blessings and all davenings as they are now organized in the mouths of all Jews. Kedei sheyiyeh inyan kol bracha aruch b'fi ha'ileg, so that the concept of every single blessing will be easily accessible and easily arranged in the mouth of he who was not able to express himself. And so, the siddur was born in its most original form. Ezra and the High Court, a formula for davening. We're going to see in the next chapter that although it's called Shmona Esrei for 18 blessings, there was a later time in history where they added a 19th blessing. And that's why today, when you read our actual Amidah, there are 19 blessings, yet we still call it Shmona Esrei because in its original form, it was 18 blessings. Halacha Hey. That was one thing Ezra and his High Court did. They established a nusach. They established a liturgy. Second thing they said, v'chein tiknu, they also established sheyehei minyan hatfilot kiminyan hakorbanot, that the number of prayers per day should match the number of sacrifices brought that day in the temple. Shtei tfilot b'chol yom, every day 2 prayers, kineged shnei tmidin, corresponding to the 2 tamid sacrifices. Tamid means constant. There were 2 sacrifices that were brought daily, once in the morning, once in the evening, and opposite them, corresponding to them, we have the Shacharit prayer and the Mincha prayer, the morning service and the afternoon service. In addition, v'chol yom sheyesh korban musaf, any day where there was an additional sacrifice in the temple, for example, Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, holiday, tiknu bo tfilah shlishit, keneged korban musaf, they established a 3rd prayer corresponding to the additional sacrifice. And that was it during the day, 2 or 3 prayers by day. Utfilah shi keneged hamid shel boker, the davening, the prayer which was enacted, corresponding to the morning tamid. Hiya nikrat tfilat hashachar. It's called the morning prayer, or shacharit as we know it. Utfilah shekeneged tamid shel ben ha'arba'im, and the prayer which was enacted, corresponding to the daily sacrifice in the afternoon. Hiya nikrat tfilat mincha. It's called the mincha service. Mincha means resting. It's as the sun is resting. It's coming to its minucha. It's setting, and that's when we daven, closer to sunset. Utfilah shekeneged hamusafin, and the davening which was enacted corresponding to the additional sacrifices, hi hanikrat tfilat hamusafin, is called musaf, the additional prayer. Now, I know what you're all thinking. What about Ma'ariv? We daven by night too. What about that? How come that wasn't mentioned? Well, says the Rambam, that was an enactment, but there was no sacrifice in the temple brought at night. It was only because the leftovers of the sacrifices by day were left to burn on the altar at night. And therefore, I can't put it in this halacha in the same category as the others, but he mentions it in the next one. Halacha vav, v'chein hitkinu, they also enacted, sheyehei adam mitpalel tfilah achad balayla, that a person should daven 1 prayer by night. Shaharei, because evrei tamid shel ben ha'arba'im, the limbs of the daily sacrifice brought in the afternoon, mitaklin v'holchin kol halayla, would be continually burnt all night. Shenemar, as it says, hi ha'olah v'gomer, it is the burnt sacrifice. The verse continues, al mokdah al mizbeach kol halayla ad haboker, which was burning on the altar all night until morning. That shows you that the daily sacrifice would burn through the night. And therefore, we should also now have a davening at night to correspond to that. And with this, we now have a total prayer of evening, morning, and afternoon, and this corresponds. Ki inyan shene'emar, it's matched to the topic which says erev, vavoker, v'tzoharayim, in the evening, in the morning, and in the afternoon. Asicha ve'ehemeh v'yishma koli. I will speak, I will cry out, and Hashem will hear my voice. This is symbolic of the 3 prayers which we do every day. However, says the Rambam, ve'ein tfilat arvit chova ki tfilat shacharit u'mincha. The prayer of arvit, the evening service, what we call Ma'ariv, is not as obligatory as the morning and afternoon prayers. The afal pichein, in Talmud it's actually called reshut. It's literally called optional. Nevertheless, says the Rambam, nahagu kol Yisrael b'chol mekomot moshvotehem. All Jews are accustomed, in all areas of their dwelling, lihitpalel arvit, to daven Ma'ariv, v'kiblu aleihem ki tfilat chova, and they have accepted it upon themselves as an obligatory daven. Halacha Zayin, now the Rambam introduces a 5th prayer. So far we have Ma'ariv, Shacharis, Musaf on days where there's an extra sacrifice, and Mincha. The Chen Tiknu, says the Rambam, they instituted this, Ezra and his High Court established Tfilah Achar Tfilat Mincha, a prayer that would be done after mincha, samuch lishkiat hachama, right before, close to sunset, beyom ha'ta'anit bilvad, only on fast days. So that we can add more supplication, more pleading, more requests for Hashem on the occasion of the fast day. This is the prayer called Ne'ilah, the closing. Klomar, which means to say, Nin'alu sha'arei shamayim ba'ad hashemesh v'nistera. The gates of heaven have closed beyond the sun, and it has now been concealed. And that's when we daven, just when the sun is being covered. Because we only daven it near the time of sunset, so it was appropriately called Ne'ilah. And it kind of matches. I told you before, Mincha is also descriptive of the sun. The sun is resting. Ne'ilah, the sun is being locked away. Today, we daven Ne'ilah not on every fast day, only on Yom Kippur. In Chassidus, it explains that Ne'ilah also has another translation. Ne'ilah means we're locked in. We're locked in with Hashem. Not we're getting locked out, but we're actually, the gates are closing behind us, and we're one with Hashem with no other disturbance. Halacha chet nimtzeu, it turns out, hatfilot b'chol yom shalosh. Davening every day is 3 times. Arvit v'shacharit u'mincha, evening, morning, and afternoon. U'b'shabbatot u'b'moadim, on Shabbos and holidays. U'b'rashei chodashim, and in the new months. 4 prayers. Shalosh shel kol yom, 3 of every day. U'tfilat ha'musafin, and the additional prayer. U'b'yom ha'kippurim 5, and on Yom Kippur we do 5. 4 elu u'tfilat ne'ilah. These 4, and the Ne'ilah prayer. Halachat Tet says the Rambam, Tfilot elu, these prayers, ein pochatin mehen. Now that they've been established by the High Court, we can never reduce them. There will never be less than 3 prayer services a day. Aval mosifin alehen, but you could add to them. If you feel prayerful and you want to express more of your praise and desires to Hashem, you can add as many times prayers as you want. Im ratza adam lehitpalel kol hayom kulo. If a person wished to daven all day, harashut biyado, the option is in his hand. However, with one caveat, the chol otana tefilot sheyosif, every additional prayer which he adds, kemo makriv nedavot, will be considered as though he is bringing a voluntary sacrifice. Because the whole idea of davening is corresponding to the sacrifices. You were able to bring voluntary sacrifices if you wished. So, when you are davening the additional prayer, you have to understand it's like you're bringing another sacrifice. Lefichach, therefore, tzarich sheyechadesh davar bechol bracha u'bracha mina emtzayot. You will have to add something novel in every one of the middle blessings, because you can't add your own prayers today to the siddur. You can't make up your own stuff. Adding prayers means you're going to daven the same Shemona Esrei another time. When you're davening it another time as a voluntary Shemona Esrei, you have to add on your own one novel point to every blessing of the middle ones. For example, you're davening in the blessing of healing. In that blessing, insert, and Hashem should heal my relative or my sick cousin or something like that. In the blessing about physical wealth, you should add a point, and I want Hashem to give me success in the office. That's what makes your prayer voluntary. Otherwise, you're literally imitating, copying the sage's blessing, and there's nothing new about it. So you have to add something new in every one of the middle blessings, me'ein abrachot, on the same topic as that blessing, and that will qualify as a voluntary sacrifice. And if you added a novel point, even in only one blessing out of the 18, dayo, that's enough. Because all you're trying to do is notify that this is a voluntary prayer, not an obligatory prayer. However, the 3 first blessings and the 3 last blessings, there's no adding to them, no subtracting from them, and there's no changing anything in them. They are as they are, and that's how they stay. The novel points which you add are only in the middle blessings. Halacha Yud ein hatzibur mitpalalin tfilat nedava. The individual can daven the voluntary addition, but the community never davens an additional prayer over the amount that was enacted by Ezra and his court. Lefisha ein hatzibur miviyin korban nedava, and it follows logically. The community is not allowed to bring a voluntary sacrifice together. They cannot therefore pray a voluntary prayer together. And even an individual who may daven extra should never daven musaf shtayim, 2 musafs. Achat chovat hayom ve'achat nedava, one corresponding to the obligation of the day, and one as a volunteer offering. Lefisha ein mitnadvin korban musaf, because even the voluntary sacrifice which we are licensed to bring can never be a korban musaf. Yesh min ha'gaonim mishahora, there are among the gaonim one who has ruled. The gaonim was the period of rabbis before the Rambam came around. After the Talmud was sealed, before the Rambam and Rashi's times. They were called the Geonim. And one of them ruled, Sha'asur lihitpalel tfilat nedava b'shabbatot v'yamim tovim, that on Shabbos and Yom Tov, Shabbos and holidays, there is no davening additional prayers at all. Because on those days in the temple, you weren't allowed to bring voluntary sacrifices, only the obligatory offerings alone. And that makes sense because on Shabbos you're not allowed to kill an animal. So there was never permission to bring anything above and beyond that which Torah had prescribed. So therefore, since davening is compared to sacrifices, we have to follow all the limitations of the sacrifices in determining which davenings we can do. So whatever rules apply to the voluntary sacrifices, as far as the times they could be brought, which sacrifices could be brought, we follow too in the idea of tefillat nedava. It's important to point out that today we're not really accustomed to doing this type of a thing. If a person wants to be more prayerful, don't daven Shmona Esrei again. Say Tehillim, say Psalms. These have incredible auspicious powers, incredible sigulot. As the Tzemach Tzedek used to say, if we would only know the power of Tehillim, we would recite it all day. So we stick to other things that have guaranteed success above in heaven, and we don't daven those additional Shmona Esreis.